Welcome to Lansdowne Library's Geek Out podcast, where we geek out about just about anything. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff.
And I'm your other co-host, Dave. And today is a very chilling episode. We're joined by two guests who you may have heard on our program before. They are Laura and Jim, both of which are fanatics of a certain species? No, that's not right.
I think it's a bit broader than that. I can never remember my whole phylum and all of those.
Just say it.
How about you say it, Mr. Not an expert, but...
Well, today we're going to talk about spiders, which will make some of your listeners cringe, perhaps. But if they haven't turned it off already, maybe we can have some interesting discourse about what spiders are, why people think they're spooky, or why some people actually, like myself, like them very much.
Or who like them because they are kind of spooky.
Okay. I fall into that category myself.
All right.
Jim, why don't you take us away with what exactly is a spider?
Well, spiders are part of the group that are called arachnids. They're in the overall phylum of arthropods, which includes insects, crustaceans, myriapods, etc. They are not insects, as a lot of people often say. Even I've seen some shows on YouTube where they're constantly referred to as insects or bugs. Bugs are a specific type of insect, although any kind of a pest is considered a bug. As in, don't bug me, man, that type of thing. But bugs are a specific type of insect, and spiders are not insects. They do not fly, like most insects can. Spiders have two basic body parts, a prosoma, which combines the head and the thorax, which is what you would have on an insect. The legs and appendages are all attached to this. And then there's a larger, usually bulbous abdomen with usually a pair or more of spinnerets. All spiders, or at least modern extant spiders, can spin silk. They use silk sometimes to build webs, but not always. Many spiders use silk to construct retreats, nests. It's used for prey capture sometimes. Many people this time of year would notice large, conspicuous orb webs in some of the bushes around their houses. The various garden spiders build these, and they are fairly plentiful around this time of year, actually beginning in late summer through the beginning of fall. You don't see as many of them much past Halloween when it starts to get kind of cold. Some spiders merely use, again, silk for building retreats. Some of the jumping spiders, for instance, as well as other spiders, make what's called a drag line. That's a piece of silk which is played out from their spinnerets when they walk along the ground. A jumping spider might clamber up on top of a twig of a bush, see an insect, and go for it. Basically jump and try and get it. And if the spider misses, the drag line is sort of like the safety net. It can sort of allow the spider to climb back up without hitting the ground. Spiders also are able to spread out pheromones by way of these drag lines. A male spider might find a female due to the pheromones inherent in this. So basically, what else do you want to know about them? There's probably a lot more we can talk about, but it might be a good idea to get kind of specific. Or maybe the thing to do is, what is it about spiders that makes people think that they're spooky? One thing that I've heard, and I think it sort of works, is that spiders walk with a kind of a halting gait. If you've ever seen a Ray Harryhausen film where it's all done in stop motion, spiders sort of look like they're in stop motion when they walk and even sometimes run. I don't know if that's exactly the reason, but the fear of spiders is known as arachnophobia, which comes from the word arachnid, and we'll explain where that word comes from a little bit later, but arachnophobia is a very real, if not irrational, fear of spiders, and it has definite symptoms that people that have this condition exhibit sometimes. Some people will actually stop functioning if they see a spider. It's just like that. In fact, there was one study that I saw, and of course, leave it to a scientist to come up with something like this, but they actually showed very young children, babies almost, pictures of different animals, and they specifically wanted to see the reaction to spiders and snakes. and the pupils on the babies actually dilated sometimes when they saw this. There's a feeling that the fear of spiders is an evolutionary thing, something that goes back to, noticing something that you should be careful of, which might hurt you. Other people feel that it's a cultural thing, because whereas arachnophobia is more common, I think, in people from Western society, whereas people in Asia eat spiders and have them around and don't exhibit the same kind of fear. So in certain cases, it might be evolutionary. In other cases, it might simply be where you live and what your basic experience with these animals is.
I personally, when I was fairly young, was exposed to the film Arachnophobia, which for quite a good chunk of my life did cause me to be absolutely terrified of the thing.
I'm sure movies like Arachnophobia it's sort of the same effect that Jaws has for sharks, where people, assume that they're all dangerous, when actually, while there are many poisonous species and some you should definitely keep away from, most are harmless and are actually really beneficial.
Over time, I obviously have gotten better with that. I literally, earlier today, rescued one from the library.
What, you picked up a spider and put it out?
Not with my bare hands.
Well, no, that's good.
Yes,
no, that's good. If you did it with your bare hands, you probably would have heard it.
Exactly.
But I
coaxed it. We actually, amusingly enough, just had a little insect observation thing.
Okay.
That I happened to have in arm's reach when I saw the spider.
Well, you did the right thing, because a spider is much more beneficial than, once you step on it, unlike a lanternfly, which you should step on, but spiders account for a lot of pests, a lot of insects. People will say that, I wish I didn't have spiders in my house. Well, if you have spiders in your house, it means that you have insects in your house, whether you want to admit it or not. As long as you have one type of infestation, you're going to have the other.
Well, Laura, what do you like about spiders, what makes them spooky or fun?
Well, I think the reason they're spooky, probably to a lot of people, which might be part of their fear, is there is something unnatural. I mean, people are afraid of a lot of insects because they have many legs, they have more than 2 eyes, and yeah, they definitely move weird, or there's just a lot of, uncertainty because, I think most animals that are considered, cute and fluffy are, never perceived as a threat, when sometimes they absolutely should be. But spiders, there's nothing really cute and fluffy about them, although I will say jumping spiders as a whole are usually pretty adorable because they have the best eyesight of any spider species because they do jump, they don't sit in a web, they don't rely on their web to catch their prey, they hunt. And they look at you with giant big eyes, they can actually move around. If you've ever seen a jumping spider in real life, or if you just even look up videos, they are pretty cute. And that's one of the reasons I love them. They're my favorite animal. Particularly favorite species is Phidippus audax, which is pretty common in this area, but it's this beautiful black and white jumping spider with the green mandibles, or
Chelicera. Chelicera are the jaw parts of a spider, and Chelicerata, by the way, is the subphylum of Arthropoda, which includes the arachnids and also the aquatic forms of sea spiders, which are still somewhat controversial, but also horseshoe crabs. Now, horseshoe crabs are the only living xiphosauride, which was a type of creature that was very common at one time. It contained, among other things, the Eurypterids, which are also called sea scorpions. But the Limulus, which is the genus that lives along the Atlantic coast, which, if you've ever seen them at the seashore, is a chelicerate. And interestingly enough, that classification may change because they have found evidence, I guess, on the molecular level or in the chromosomes that horseshoe crabs are very closely related to an animal which is known as a ricinuliid, which is called a hooded tick spider. Now, it's not a true spider, but it is an arachnid, and horseshoe crabs may be very closely related to them. So I remember one paper, a scientist had tongue-in-cheek reference to horseshoe crabs as being an arachnid. Well, it may turn out to be that that's the case, but that still needs some more study. But if you ever flipped a horseshoe crab over, you see they're very spider-like. They do have chelicera, but they're not terrestrial. They have book gills. Spiders have book lungs, and they are the horseshoe crabs is an entirely aquatic form. But in any case, they may be closer to spiders than has been known before. But they've always sort of said they were closely related to spiders and scorpions. Scorpions also, I just might say, are also arachnids. Arachnids take in scorpions, ticks, mites, sun spiders. There's a various group of animals that fall into this group. You were about to say.
They come from a really cool family. But kind of back to the point about why do I like them because they're spooky. I generally do like things that most people are a little afraid of because it's sort of finding beauty in the things that we're not supposed to. But yeah, I think, in fact, jumping spiders have been seen more in popular culture. There are so many plushies if you look at them online because they kind of are
They're the cute furry spider.
They are, yes.
Like Lucas, if you've ever seen the
Lucas the spider.
Lucas films.
How Lucas is doing.
I don't know if they've ever made any, but if you've never seen Lucas the spider, Google it, and they're kind of endearing, funny little films.
What was, Jeff, I don't know if you remember it, but there was a game recently where you played as a jumping spider. It was like was it Webbed?
Yes, yeah, I think that was the title. It was a bit of an oddity because, yeah, you would think with the name like Webbed it would be more about wrapping, making your actual web, but it was mostly a jumping mechanic using the web as a lifeline.
That's really
as
cool.
we had described.
And they're really colorful. If you've seen probably like the video of like a peacock jumping spider, it has a really elaborate kind of bird of paradise like mating dance that it's just really fascinating to watch. They're so... I think a lot of people have an easier time accepting jumping spiders because they are kind of the cute ones. But even other spider species can be so fascinating. Even like, I think black widows have a certain kind of like scary but beautiful like
They
form.
definitely have a unique charm to them because it is a really delicate looking... Absolutely. Well, they're only dangerous if you give them reason to be.
Absolutely.
It's the correct response to seeing a black widow's nest or any of the spiders that have decided to look like the widows to sort of protect themselves is just leave it alone.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you can safely move it to a new location, that's fine. But, it's again... While it could potentially be a danger to children, the correct response is to keep children away from it.
I definitely advocate for don't handle any animal or insect or arachnid that you are not familiar with, or even if you think you can handle it, maybe don't always play on the safe side. But definitely these animals deserve respect. They can be really beautiful, and they're pretty incredible. Like, we probably would have a lot more problems with invasive species and harmful insects without them. Respect.
Yes, actually, speaking of sort of both arachnophobia and sort of touching on video games here, that game Grounded just came out, which is sort of a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids survival game where you play as a shrunken person, essentially in someone's front yard. And one of the enemy types is you can end up against a gigantic spider that prowls the map. The developers of the game were credited with implementing a mode that, when you turn it on, essentially removes the texture of the spider. So it looks kind of like a simplified, like almost just a polygonal mess instead of like 8 eyes, fangs, and all the, essentially taking the creepiness out of it without removing the concept entirely.
Yeah, this is actually a fairly common thing in modern video games is people are afraid of spiders. We have giant spiders, or a very common enemy in not just games, but media in general. Mm-hmm. So how do we deal with that? And a lot of games have been finding ways to make them look almost comical in some cases. I remember the first mod for Skyrim for arachnophobes literally just put a bear texture over the spider, which was worse.
I was going to say,
it was so much worse because you had a spider that was moving like a bear that was moving like a spider, and
no, that's
exactly
awful.
But it is kind of interesting to see that culturally we are aware now of these fears to the point that we are trying to mitigate them in our media to an extent.
Mm.
Well, usually, I guess they exploit the fear in a lot of movies, because I can remember seeing, what was it, the one Harry Potter film with, what was it, Aragog or something?
Aragog.
But, Aragog had lots of buddies. I mean, it wasn't just him. And the whole thing, I mean, what was it? What's his name? Is it Bloody hell? Because he's covered in spiders practically.
Ron Weasley.
Exactly.
There's also Shelob.
Oh,
Let's not forget.
Tolkien.
Well, I mean, even before Shelob, there are the unnamed spiders in The Hobbit.
You got to give Tolkien a little bit of credit, though, because he never actually, if I remember correctly, I'm not a Tolkien expert or anything, but I do know about this, is that he doesn't specifically say, he describes Shelob as being spider-like. Because if you've seen the movie, I haven't read the books, but if you see the movie, Shelob has a stinger. No spiders have stingers. Spiders have fangs. They have to basically bite to inject the venom. But it was a pretty creepy part of the movie, and it was kind of effective, I have to say.
Shelob's also, I think, based on a New Zealand species because the filmmakers are from New Zealand.
Well,
and that's sort of their nod to where
what's
the
his
film was
name?
made.
Who is it?
Peter Jackson?
Peter Jackson said he's afraid of the local spider, but there are all kinds of things in the design of that character that don't jibe with arachnid, or I should say spider physiology. But in any case, it doesn't matter. When you're watching a movie, you sort of just take it as it is. And I mean, I used to laugh when I would watch a film made back in the 50s called Tarantula. Okay, it was a Universal International typical Jack Arnold produced picture. And like in a lot of movies, the heroine of the movie, played by Mara Corday, is getting undressed in her bedroom. And of course, the audience can see a huge spider outside. Well, the spider outside is not a tarantula because its jaws aren't oriented properly, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But why a huge spider that's about 2 or 3 stories tall would drool over a human woman that it has absolutely, no chance of making it with, if you want to say that.
Maybe he's hungry.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned the orientation of the jaws. It might be interesting to note that basically there are 2 types of spiders. There are the arachnid, which are the true spiders. And I say true spiders in the respect that they are the typical spiders. It doesn't mean that the other animals that are considered spiders are not spiders. But in the arachnid, the jaws are more or less opposed. If you think of a pair of ice tongs or a pair of pliers, they touch back and forth. I'm doing this with my fingers, but nobody can see this.
Yeah,
in any case, the other form of spider is the megalomorphs. And these are the large, hairy spiders that are sometimes considered to be more primitive. It's not really fair to consider that because they've been very successful alongside all the rest of the spiders. But megalomorph spiders, their jaws strike downwards like a pickaxe. They're also considered, I guess they're considered to be kind of more primitive. And there's a third group known as the mesothelae, which only live in Southeast Asia, Japan, and some of the other countries. And they're like a form of trapdoor spider, but unusually they have segmented abdomens. Now, there are other arachnids like scorpions that their bodies are entirely segmented, but true spiders, the arachnid, are basically their abdomens are not segmented. Okay, that's a very interesting thing. If you see of a like Lephistius is a type of mesothelid, and they look quite different. But again, there's 3 groups of spiders that I just mentioned, and they're all spiders, even though the arachnid are the ones that are called true spiders. It doesn't mean that the other ones aren't real spiders. They're just not considered to be typical.
Atypical spiders.
Well, interesting that you mentioned that, because atypical is the word for a genus of megalomorph known as the Atypidae, I guess. And that's because they were considered to be atypical tarantulas. Now, I guess it's a good time for me to bring this up. But Lansdowne figures in arachnid history or natural history in the respect that we have our own basic spider in Lansdowne, which was first discovered in 1970. There was a situation where a landowner on North Lansdowne Avenue who had an in-ground pool found that his property around the pool was invaded by a bunch of strange-looking spiders, looked like actually huge ants with long jaws. He didn't know what they were, and none of the local pest control people knew, so they called in Dr. Robert Snetzinger from Penn State University. He was often known as Butterfly Bob. He was the head entomologist, who's, by the way, a person who studies insects, but entomologists are usually up on arachnids and other things. And they came down to the property and they located the animals, again, that had invaded. And it turned out that what they were looking at was a type of purseweb spider. Now, purseweb spiders, or as they were known as atypical tarantulas, build a kind of a burrow which is lined with silk. It's basically a silk tube. And this is extended up above ground, usually attached to a side of a tree, a rock, the foundation of your house, or a hedge. So it's a long silken tube, and they camouflage it so that it looks like, for all the world, it looks like a root or a vine. And what happens is that insects, normally flies, will land on this. The spider in the burrow will detect the motion and will run up. And these spiders have very long fangs, and they will bite through the tube and pull the prey, the insect or whatever, inside. That's basically the way they operate. They're called pursewebs because the man who described them, Dr. Abbott, back around, it was around the 1700s, 1790s or so, described them. And at that time, women's purses were long, silken affairs. And he likened the web of the spider to a lady's purse. So that's where the term comes from. But the Lansdowne spider had not been discovered before. Dr. Snetzinger's graduate student, Patricia Sarno, described the animal for the first time, and it appeared in a paper in 1973. And it was not known outside of this area. In fact, even in this area, nobody probably knew it. Female purseweb spiders spend their entire life underground or in their silken purseweb. The only ones you're liable to see are the males, which walk around in late summer looking for females. I've caught a few males, and a friend of mine who does work around over at Wildman Arms called me one day and said, "Hey, I found another purseweb." I said, "Okay, come on over. I'll give you lunch." And he took his break and came over. And as we sat there, I looked at it and I said, "You know something? There's a good possibility that the owner is at home." And we were able to coax a large, possibly a full-grown female out of the web, which we photographed, and I now have some better information than I had on those. But in any case, the Lansdowne spider, or some people call it the Philadelphia purseweb, or they have other names for it, but I think it should be the Lansdowne purseweb because it was discovered here. And it seems to be endemic to Pennsylvania. That means the only place it's found. It's also found around Delaware County, possibly into Chester, possibly up into Bucks County. But it has a very limited range. And that was something that arachnologists were sort of curious about. Why just here? What's the deal? Why wouldn't it be anyplace else? So recently, and this is a kind of a stop the presses moment, there was a paper that was just published online in July. And they have determined by looking at the DNA, the chromosomes, I should say, of this spider, and it's identical to a spider found in Asia. So they've now determined that Lansdowne spider is actually one that has come here, possibly in a potted plant or something. And you can guess when that was. Nobody really knows, again, because it's a kind of a poorly known spider. You don't see it. They're actually all over the place. If you look hard enough, you'll find them in your hedges and other places, much to the chagrin of some people I've told this to, but at the same time, they're kind of fascinating, and even though it probably originated in Asia, like there's many spiders that have come from other parts of the world, which we have here, but it's still kind of interesting, and there aren't many of them around in the U.S. It's the only species of Atypus in the U.S. All the other purseweb spiders in this country were reclassified by Dr. Gertsch and Norman Platnick, and they changed the genus to Sphodros. But the Lansdowne spider is still considered Atypus. Normally they're only found, again, in Asia and in Europe, except in southeastern Pennsylvania. So we have the only Atypus. It may not be as unique as we thought it was at one time, but it's still, very fascinating. And again, it's kind of a local thing that a lot of people don't know about. If you look around, you find a lot of natural history where you wouldn't expect it.
I like calling it the Lansdowne spider, and I think that should be its official name.
You know why it's called the Philadelphia spider? Probably because it was like, oh, where are you from? Lansdowne. Lansdale? Philly. I'm from Philly.
Or Delco. We could call it the Delco spider.
No, I'm pretty sure that's probably reserved for a very specific different thing.
Well, most of it's Delco. They haven't really found. They found in Philadelphia. They found it, and it has been, like I say, probably in Lower Bucks County, Montgomery County, and into what is it out there, Chester County.
Mm.
They have done. There's been a study going on. Now, one of the fellows that studied this spider early on was Stephen Tesler, and he has organized. They mapped the spider program where people on social media report where they've seen them. But so far, it's still rather, it's a rather small area. And so far, nobody has really come across any of the other purseweb spiders. There's reports of some of them along the coast in New Jersey and in Delaware, but apparently this particular spider has its niche here, and the others don't seem to be around.
Well, maybe we can find them if we just start throwing some cheesesteaks and some webs, or...
Say go birds.
Go birds. Yeah, you hear a little echo.
A true Philadelphian spider.
Well, if it had been sort of a velvety orange, they could have called it, gritty. But
I mean, there's pumpkin spiders for that, right?
That.
Well, yeah, the pumpkin spider is kind of interesting, it's actually Arachnid marmorius, which is the marbled orb weaver. And that animal has several different forms, but one of the more striking form is a bright yellow spotted abdomen with bright orange and red legs. So it's called the Halloween spider or the pumpkin spider because this time of year the females are gravid with eggs. They're big and fat, and when you see one in the woods, they can be rather conspicuous.
Didn't they get dressed up for the holiday?
So we've mentioned now the purseweb and the orb weaver. I know there are a bunch of different types of essentially webs that the spiders make. There's the orb weavers, there's funnel, there's trapdoor. Now, are they all separate families themselves?
Well, usually they are. The trapdoor spiders generally are all megalomorphs. The closest to our region where they live is there are some in the southeast. But generally they go across, they're rather common up and down the Pacific coast. I say common, you really have to go looking for them. But in Southern California, and they have different types of webs. For instance, there's actually one that lives in western Pennsylvania, and that makes what's called a wafer lid type of lid to its trapdoor. I guess to elaborate on that, the trapdoor spider has a burrow, and it spins a kind of a silken lid to it, which again is camouflaged. And anything that walks by, the spider will run out and grab it and take it in. You have to really know what you're looking for in order to find one of these. But they can be found. There's various types that live in Africa, other places. But the trapdoor spiders, again, they're in that group of spiders that are considered to be more... I want to use the word primitive, but it's really not fair to the spider is a fully evolved creature that has lived for millions of years, and it's not a failure or shouldn't be considered primitive in any respect. That's why, when people say something's a dinosaur because it's outdated and extinct, the human species will be darn lucky if it even begins to approach the amount of years that dinosaurs even dominated the world.
Same for spiders, then. They outlive us or have outranked us on this planet.
Yeah, let's see. We're talking about other kinds of... You have your orb webs, and certain orb webs make different types of snares. There's what's called the bolus spider, which is in the orb web family, but this spider is actually kind of clever. It has a gob of glue on the end of a silken strand, which it spins around like the bolus in Argentina. The gauchos use them to, rope cattle. Now, sitting on a branch and hoping that something comes by that you're going to be able to use your bolus with wouldn't really cut it. But the spider's a bit more insidious. It actually emits a kind of a scent that mimics the pheromone of a specific type of female moth. So basically what it does is it lures male moths in, to which it captures. And even though it's in the orb weaver family, it doesn't make an orb web. It's that type of mechanical contrivance, if you will, that it's able to catch things with. This time of year, you see a lot of sheet webs, or sometimes funnel webs. The Agelenopsis, the grass spiders, sometimes called funnel web spiders, which you see a lot of in hedges and things. It's sort of a net of silk. You see them this time of year because they're usually covered with dew. They're usually there all the time, but in the late summer and early fall, they're covered with droplets of water. And these spiders sit and wait for something to, land on the web, and they run out and drag it back in. We're talking about different types of webs. There's a spider called a ray spider. It builds a type of orb web, which is merely a few strands. If you think of an orb web as being a round type of thing, this one merely has a few strands, which is almost a triangular type of web. And that's fairly different. Now you have cobweb weavers, of which the comb-footed spiders, of which the notorious black widow is one, have what seems to be a tangle of silk that doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason. But the spider itself knows its way around that. It should be mentioned, too, that spiders that build aerial webs, I'm not talking about the hunters or any of the ground spiders, the ones that run around and capture prey that way, but the ones that depend on their webs, depend on the webs for pretty much what we use our ears and eyes for. Spiders have ridiculously poor eyesight, with the exception of jumping spiders and wolf spiders. Their bodies are covered in basically sensory hairs, but in the case of orb webs, the web itself can transmit information that the spider needs. In many cases, you take a spider out of its web and it's nearly helpless. It would be very difficult sometimes for it to find its way around. But the widows are probably the best known of all the cobweb weavers. I have never come across the black widow in Lansdowne. I've had some that I've studied that come from down in Millville. My brother lives down there, and if I need one, I just have to go into his yard and I'll find one, or maybe even in his basement. But I've never encountered one in Lansdowne, so it's not saying that they're not here, but it's not the type of spider that's relatively common. You do have spiders of the genus Steatota, which is, in Britain, they call them the false widows. They are not as dangerous as the black widows. I guess maybe we ought to mention spider venom and dangerous spiders in that respect, because we bring up the widow, which is probably the most dangerous, but it's not dangerous in the respect that it's coming to get you. If you happen to, let's say you put on a shirt and there's a spider resting in it, you're liable to get bitten. Before indoor plumbing was common, most people were bitten in their outhouses, because let's face it, the outhouse is an open pit, and it's very attractive to flies. So why wouldn't a spider build her web there, and why wouldn't she bite somebody that happens to come in contact with her web? And we're going to leave it at that. But in any case, that's one of the places. Southern California was a place of migrant workers and people that picked vegetables and things in some of the farms. That was a typical type of person who would get bitten.
There was a news story not too long ago of a construction worker in Australia that was using a porta potty and got bit, and then it happened again a few months later.
But you see, that's the reason. There are several different species of black widow. Our black widow is known as I said before, Latrodectus mactans. It basically translates to something to the effect of thieving, robber, biter. It was known to be dangerous even by American Indians. They supposedly would catch the spiders and crush them and coat their arrows with them, knowing that there's, venom or something in the spider that's dangerous. But there's a Mediterranean version. There's one in Australia, the redback. There's 2 or 3 different species in the United States. There's another one that I've encountered over in New Jersey in the Pines, which is the northern widow. Difference usually is that the hallmark of the black widow is it's bright black and shiny. It was often called the shoe button spider or the hourglass spider because it has an hourglass marking, 2 opposed triangles that are bright red, and it's very striking to see one of these alive. The northern widow, which tends to be a bit browner rather than dark black, the two triangles are often separated, but that's not always the case. Yes, the other dangerous spider in the United States is considered to be the brown recluse, which scientific name is Loxosceles reclusa. Okay, now there are other species of this genus in the United States. Many people will tell you they've been bitten by a recluse, but unless you are living in Kansas, that part of the world, Oklahoma, Texas, you probably aren't going to encounter one. Which isn't to say one could not have come in a chest of drawers that you had moved from Texas or someplace east, but they're not really from this area. A lot of people blame spiders on all kinds of bites and dermatological situations, but in many cases it's not a spider at all. People just assume that. It's a kind of an overhyped thing, which isn't to say that these spiders aren't dangerous. It's just that many times people just aren't bitten.
They're a good scapegoat for people because they are unpopular in many ways.
Right, but you have to basically, give them their own space. It's like the kind of a thing where, you don't want to.
If you go into a cage with a tiger, you don't get to complain that you were mauled to death.
Yeah.
It's the same with spiders. It's give them their space. That, as far as I'm aware, at least, there are no spiders that are actively hunting humans.
True.
No, there are some that will, I think, have a more propensity to bite. There's a spider that lives in this area. It's Tracheolus tranquillus. It's a little spider, has sort of a whitish abdomen, dark black carapace, and it has sort of dull red legs. Mm-hmm. They make their way into people's houses in the fall. Now, they're not particularly dangerous, except for one thing. They have been observed feeding on dead animals. Spiders, first of all, I should mention, are carnivorous, except for one example, which I'm going to explain in a minute. They eat live prey. But this spider will revisit maybe a dead insect and sharpen its fangs on it. And I've seen this happen. I actually made video of one that I had kept in a small bug keeper one time. And the problem with that is that you could get a secondary infection from, bacteria on the spider's fangs if you were to be bitten and if it were, going to break the skin. I saw one time, I was sitting in the kitchen where I used to live over in New Jersey, and my brother had come home. He had, was taking classes, and it had to be like 2 a.m, so it was dead quiet, and one of these decided to walk across the table. And so just for the fun of it, I put a pencil in front of it, figuring it would run off. But instead, it actually advanced on the pencil and started to scrape its fangs on it. Now, I say this because I could actually hear it. It was, it made that much of a noise.
He was bold.
So it didn't seem to be phased. So if you see one of those in your house, leave it alone or they'll step on it. It's, like I say, it's in your house. And the same goes true to the yellow sac spiders, which you're liable to see in the house, the genus Chirocanthium. Chirocanthium mildi is a species that was brought apparently from Europe, but it's well established in the United States. It is slightly medically important in the respect that if you're bitten and it does envenomate you, you could come down with a slight fever. It would be more dangerous to an older person or a child, and there could be a necrosis that could develop around the site of the bite. That's where the flesh begins to die. That's what happens with the recluse spiders sometimes. An interesting side note to the Chirocanthium, the yellow sac spiders. Some years ago, I think it was around 2011, Mazda recalled many cars, and they did it again in 2014 because, as it turns out, the vents for the gas line were attracting these spiders. These spiders apparently are very fond of hydrocarbons as it comes in gasoline. Is it hydrocarbons, not fluorocarbons? Hydrocarbons.
Wrong person.
That sounds right.
Well, in any case, the fuel line was just the right size for one of these spiders' constructed sac. So they were getting into the cars, and whereas I don't think there were any actual problems, but Mazda thought well enough of it to recall the cars and modify them because they were afraid that these spiders making their little retreats in the gas lines could cause a leak or possibly a fire. So that's one example. And I think it has happened with other cars, notably certain diesel makes and certain, I think Ford even had some problems with it where they had to re-engineer some things because, again, these spiders are around. They're very common. They live outside, but they also live in your houses, and they're certainly, if they're getting high on the gasoline, they're going to climb in there and do what they have to. And
we would have expected spiders to be huffing gas, but here we are.
That is a bit of an unexpected
They're
twist.
incredible. A lot of things. They're pretty great.
I mean, it's not the first time I've heard about spiders being a problem with cars, but generally that's the huntsman spider in Australia specifically. They tend to like the inside of cars, and
Nice and warm, I bet.
generally not dangerous. They are very large, and again, while technically not dangerous by themselves, they have caused a number of car accidents.
right. Well, the huntsman spiders have the largest leg span. You don't really measure a spider by leg span. You measure it by the what they call the TBL, total body length, which is the prosoma, that's the head and thorax section, along with the abdomen. Spider size is not judged by leg span, but as far as that goes, they're the largest spiders. Now, the largest spiders are found in the northern reaches of the Amazon, even places like Venezuela. Theraphosa blondie is considered to be the world's largest spider by weight. It's a rather good-sized animal. I forget how many grams it could be. They're heavy. I mean, their leg span is about the size of maybe a dinner plate. That's what they usually say. But if you were to put your hand next to one of them, the palm of your hand would be more or less filled by the body of the spider. Now, that's a pretty good-sized spider. In fact, they're hunted down there, and I remember seeing a book on all kinds of stuff that you can eat in the jungle, and one guy had the body of one of these spiders on his machete that he was happily cooking over the fire, and I imagine it tastes like crab. But in any case, that's about your size of spiders. I mean, you look at fossil record, and at one time they thought they had found a large spider fossil, which they called Megarachnia, was the genus. And the person who had the fossil was rather jealous of it, and when they finally allowed it to be examined by a group of different naturalists, they determined that it was in fact a Eurypterid, another animal in the sea scorpion family. They're related to spiders, but it wasn't a spider. When they made that TV series called Walking with, Prehistoric Beasts or whatever?
Monsters?
No, something like that. They had Megarachnia in there. And when it was finally discovered that it wasn't a spider, they simply redid the narration. Mm-hmm. And they left it in. They called it Mesothelae, which is, again, I mentioned before, was a type of segmented spider in Europe. So the sequences of this big spider are too good to throw away, but they had to change it. And it's very difficult to imagine a spider even ever getting that size. The only reason that certain arthropods, like dragonflies and other animals like Arthroplurus, which was a huge millipede way back when, I'm not sure exactly how far back it goes, probably around 350 million years ago, the Earth's atmosphere was much more oxygen-rich. Spiders breathe through what are called book lungs, and the air goes across these. They don't breathe air in. It goes across their book lungs, and that form of respiration does not allow for, an arthropod in this day and age to get very large. Now, the ones that live in the ocean, like lobsters and giant, Japanese crabs and other things like that, get pretty big, but they live down deep in the water, and again, they breathe by way of gills. They're not air breathers. So, when you see one of these movies where there's a giant spider the size of a house, it's not likely. But then again, you take away all the fun if you try and say that can't happen.
We've gotten a huge focus on the biology and the etymology and all of that on spiders, but I kind of want to transition more into this, the cultural impact, the media impact, because spiders are everywhere.
I do think it's worth mentioning. We talked a little bit about the portrayal in movies and how that might have something to do with modern perception. But if you look at folklore, there's a lot of spiders that, sure, they may not be good guys, but there's a lot that are, or even just sort of neutral but important spirits and gods in folklore.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have Anansi, of course.
Anansi, the best.
The trickster deity. Depending on which of the hundreds of different cultures you ask in the early Americans, some of
the
them
Lakota.
the Lakota have them as the chief god, don't they? That's
I'm not sure about that.
Spider?
Well, that's the Hopi. The
Yes,
grandmother.
that's Hopi.
And she's an entirely benign spirit.
Yeah.
She imparts knowledge. And it's interesting because you go back to Anansi. Anansi is a very crafty kind of a trickster, as well as someone who disseminates knowledge. He likes to tell stories, is a great storyteller, and he likes to hear stories. But the one thing that about him is that if you're going to tell Anansi a story, it better be a damn good one. Otherwise, he will not, suffer fools. He'll just go away from you.
Definitely a chaotic neutral, probably.
Yeah.
Oh, Tom Bombadil.
There's also the Jirogomo, I believe, in Japan folklore.
Yep, the yokai.
And there's a couple of spider yokai. And generally, they are not very positive figures in Japan, which is surprising.
Well, considering that the Jirogomo, depending on how you want to say it, was apparently translated more lately as, I'm trying to think, ensnaring newlywed wife.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Prior to that, it was a less complimentary
Yeah. That there was, I believe one translation of the yokai essentially was just spider prostitute.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah. Not the most charming of images there.
There definitely is a variety of how they're portrayed by different cultures and, have gone through media. Although, kind of on the subject of Japan, I've noticed a lot of, modern manga use spiders in kind of a friendly or cute way. There's,
Oh, yeah. I mean...
My Life with a Giant Spider, and it's just
I'm a spider, so what?
The one is, a little girl in the woods with a giant pet spider that's taking care of her. What's not to love?
And the other one is an isekai about returning to life in a fantasy world, but you're just a standard spider enemy.
I've been meaning to read that.
It gets a bit weird as it goes on, but every isekai gets kind of weird the longer it goes on.
But there's definitely a lot of growing up, I watched a lot of Reading Rainbow with LeVar Burton, and Anansi was a popular story and figure, and he was one of my favorites as a kid. I also love stories about Grandmother Spider. Sometimes they are just very helpful, benign spirits. Sometimes they are outright evil or just kind of chaotic gods.
And I mean, you also, of course, have in the literary world Charlotte's Web.
True. That was one of my favorites as a kid as well.
Well, very interesting because I've never actually read that book, but I was doing some research on it for this talk. And I was surprised and rather delighted to know that Charlotte actually has a name. Her name is Charlotte A. Clavaticus, I think.
Yeah.
Arachnid or Arrhenius clavaticus is the scientific name for the barn spider, which is what Charlotte is. Exactly. The interesting thing, too, is spider characters, I think because of their web-building ability, are often considered to be creative, crafty, and industrious. That's another, there's a famous painting, I think it was, I can't remember the painter, Renaissance painter, and it's the figure of Arachne, who I guess we ought to discuss in a minute. And she's holding up, I think, a spider building a web, and the whole idea is industry. Again, creative, the making of things.
They're usually used as familiars to represent creativity and building.
Yeah, which makes sense. I mean, when you think of a spider, at least when I think of a spider, the first thing I think of is a web. And sure, what I imagine is not accurate of all spiders by any means, but that's just sort of culturally where my head goes.
Yeah, I think it's one of the obvious symbols. I mean, the form of an orb web with its various, the radius, the radii around with the snares built in between it. One thing I haven't mentioned is spiders make more than one kind of silk. Some of it is not sticky, but some of it is. And the spider knows exactly where to walk on its own web. It is rather fascinating if you take the time on a summer or a fall night to actually watch a spider build a web. It's almost inconceivable that it tends to be able to construct the whole thing. Oh, I wanted to mention, we talked about Jirogumo. Another spider that's been in the news is the Juro spider, named for Juragumo. It's another Asian spider that's come to the United States and is pretty much established in certain counties in Georgia. They believe it's come in sea containers. It has been moving northward, and there's a good possibility in a few years that we're going to have this spider here because it's more tolerant of a temperate climate. It can tolerate colder nights, and so it might actually be able to establish itself. I don't know, if that's going to happen. Probably not in my lifetime, although I'd like to think that it will spread because spiders do balloon, and I guess I better explain that really quickly. When spiders are born, the little spiders come out and they trail out long strands of silk.
Just like in Charlotte's Web.
Exactly. They do not fly, but they can free balloon in that respect, so that spiders can transport themselves over great distances. The reports of sailing ships with sheets and sheets of gossamer hanging from the sails. Those are from spiders that have blown out to sea and are just looking to travel. But in any case, the Jura spider might make it up as far as this if they balloon this far. Otherwise, it's going to be a while before they get here. And the other thing, too, is spiders are often named for different things. Naturalists have a sense of humor. And there was a couple by the name of George and Elizabeth Peckham who were naturalists, and they studied jumping spiders. And in 1896, they described one from Costa Rica, and they named it Bagheera Kiplingi because they were fans of the Jungle Book. It was one of about 3 or 4 spiders that were named after characters out of that book. There's any number of celebrities who have had spiders named after them. Stephen Colbert, I think Leonardo DiCaprio. All right, I have a whole list of spiders named after...
Give it to him rapid fire. Let's do it.
There's a trapdoor spider named after Angelina Jolie. Okay. There is Barack Obama has a trapdoor spider named after him. Tobey Maguire appropriately has a spider.
He deserves a spider.
Exactly. There's David Bowie.
Nice.
Harrison Ford. John Lennon.
Spiders from Mars.
Nelson Mandela has 2 spiders named after him, at least. And I think I mentioned the other ones. So, as you can see, naturalists have a lot of fun, and they like to name some of what they discover after people they admire, usually in the entertainment or political arena. In any case, wanted to mention arachne. We sort of touched on some of the cultural, literary spiders, but arachne is the Greek character who is a woman who's very good at weaving, naturally, and compares herself to Athena, who was the goddess of the loom and all that business. This is, as I mentioned, in Greek mythology. And so naturally, Athena gets ticked, and they have a weaving competition. And Athena does a beautiful tapestry, basically highlighting the accomplishments and glory of the gods.
I think specifically Poseidon, if I remember right.
Maybe. But what Arachne does is she does more of a condemnation about how the gods are always, taking advantage of morals and
she printed the truth.
Exactly. And that didn't set well, even though
was she like the first person that was canceled then?
Possibly.
Like she's a victim of cancel culture.
Exactly. But you see what happens is that Athena recognizes how good her work is, but she's infuriated by the intent, and so she slaps Arachne around, and Arachne is basically humiliated, and she's embarrassed, and she goes and hangs herself. But Arachne takes pity on her and Athena takes pity on her and changes her form into that of a spider. So in Greek mythology, she's supposed to be the very first spider, and that's where the term arachnid comes from. Okay, it's, again, like so many other things, something out of classical mythology or myth or legend and such. So
definitely a big Arachne supporter after that myth.
I mean, there's a lot of figures in Greek mythology that I feel like
deserve better.
Should have had better, yeah. Medusa being the other fairly obvious one.
Well, a lot of them, Europa gets changed into a cow and other things. It's
Or
never
women
their
in
fault.
treatments.
It's always Zeus or somebody
Yeah,
just
Zeus, Poseidon
can't,
The worst.
keep his...
can't keep to himself.
Exactly.
Well, as we come to time here on this episode, just do a quick round robin of what's your favorite spider?
Well, I said it earlier, but jumping spiders, Phidippus audax is probably my favorite species.
Well, there's so many different kinds, so many that we didn't even get to mention tonight. I'm also a fan of Phidippus, and one of Phidippus's relatives, the emerald spider, which is absolutely gorgeous. And the funny thing about that is they're very dimorphic. The males and females look very different, but they're both gorgeous little spiders. So I would have to say probably jumping spiders in general, simply because of they're aware of you, and they will look up at you. Other spiders aren't. They'll just crawl away because they can sense that you're there. But nonetheless, I would say that's mine.
Goodness, I can't remember the full name. I know that the second half is Metallicus, and it is this brilliant cobalt blue tarantula.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I believe it begins with a P, but the name is escaping me at the moment. But they don't look, and this is true to be fair of a lot of the coloration on spiders, like they look like nothing else in nature.
Mm-hmm.
They look so unnatural, and I find it so fascinating.
That's awesome.
I think I just like the ogre spider. It's kind of funny looking.
It does have that fantastic face.
Big old eyes.
That's the one we should have talked about with different kinds of webs. It didn't occur to me, but the ogre spider is also known as the net casting spider. It actually builds a small web that it casts like a net, and that's how it's called the ogre spider because it has these huge eyes, and if you look at its face, it looks like an ogre.
This has been a really enlightening talk, and hopefully it sets the mood for a little bit of appreciation, but some spookiness for the October month. Thank you, Jim and Laura, for coming on and talking.
It's a pleasure to have both of you.
Anytime.
And if you would like to be on the Geek Out podcast and talk about something you're really passionate about, where can you find us, Jeff?
Well, you can head right over to lansdownelibrary.org/podcast, and there's a green register here button. And this is a bit of an odd statement for a podcast, but if you're not somebody who's particularly comfortable with the internet or, that sort of thing, we do now have a sign-up sheet at the library as well.
So come on down and sign up, and we'll get you on here.